of the Council Budget and Effectiveness Committee. Why don't we start as we usually do with introductions, beginning in the back of the room over there. Sir.
Mr. Schneider, Communications Director.
Ann Bromberger, Strategy and Budget.
Marie Harris, Strategy and Budget.
Jeremy Mills, Council Communications.
Lauren Livingston, Strategy and Budget.
Renee Johnson, District 4.
Julie Eisel, Committee Member.
Ed Driggs, Committee Chair.
Malcolm Graham, Committee Member.
Braxton Winston, Council Member at Large.
Angela Lee, Assistant City Manager.
Marcus Jones, City Manager.
Ryan Bergman, Strategy and Budget.
So, Happy New Year, everybody. I wanted to explain quickly before we start, this is the Budget and Effectiveness Committee, which includes the functions of our Budget Committee in the past, overseeing our budget process, but also has taken on the responsibilities that were formerly held by the Governance and Accountability Committee, and on this occasion is functioning as the Council Retreat Committee. So we have a variety of responsibilities, but we're here today to talk about the retreat, and I would like to hand over to Angela Lee for some opening comments.
Sure. Good morning, council members. Today our objective is to discuss the agenda for our annual strategy meeting. We also have staff here who is going to record comments such that we can provide those to the mayor. And so I will defer to our manager who's going to discuss the agenda.
Okay. So thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. I don't come to a lot of these, so it's interesting. So the correct way is to refer to you as Mr. Chair, correct?
Please do. Yeah, I like
Okay.
that.
Mr. Chair, I got it. All right, thank you. That's learning for me.
What I'd like to do, because we have a mix of council members in terms of being at the last retreats versus the 2020 retreat. And what I'd like to do is talk just a little bit about some of the things we've learned over the course of the 3 retreats that I have been a part of. And one of the great takeaways has been, staff, please don't talk at us for 2.5 days. So what we've attempted to do is make sure that there is significant time for council to collaborate with a facilitator based on some of the questions that you have provided to the team prior to the retreat. There's been a survey that was handed out, and it's interesting. Well, we should have come to understand what would come back to us, and it's pretty consistent. The 2040 comp plan, transportation transit plan, affordable housing, budget and funding, public safety, upward mobility, jobs, business growth, council interaction, operations. So we're using some of the questions that you've had to develop pre-reads before the retreat. My promise to you is not to give you a 6-inch binder that you're so inundated with documents that you don't have time to read them, but to do something that's pretty quick. We call them hot sheets, where in a very 90-second read you can get a feeling of what's going on in terms of some of these areas. The other thing that I think is important is to talk about just process going forward. At the retreat, we from a staff level, we think of this as a playbook, and what are some of the policies, programs, initiatives that you want us to implement over the course of the next year or the next few years. One of the a very good retreat we had was a couple of years ago when we talked about affordable housing, and it was very clear what the short-term goals were, the medium-term goals, and long-term goals, as well as what's hard to achieve and what's difficult to achieve. And we will give you a scoring sheet on what has occurred over the course of the last 2 years. So our desire is the facilitator that we have this year, who you are familiar with, that has been our facilitator for the last couple of years, can help us along that way. If you'll just give me 2 more minutes, Mr. Chair. If you go back to the council calendar, this is not a one-shot deal and then we're done. As a matter of fact, on February 5th, you'll have your first budget workshop, and then each first Wednesday until the budget is delivered, there will be workshops. And those workshops can go a couple hours, they can go half a day. It's just the opportunity to make sure that council is abreast of what's occurring, but also holding the team accountable to make sure that we're providing information to you. On a quick math, if we're a little bit north of 20 hours on this retreat, and 75% of the time is just dedicated to council talking amongst yourselves with the facilitator, with many of the issues that have popped up prior to the retreat. So, Mr. Chair, that's at 30,000 feet. I could be willing to go as deep as you want to over each of the days, but we're here to provide you with answers to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Manager. And I wanted to point out we're meeting here partly because we did have in the past a council retreat committee of council members. This year, the preparations for the retreat were made largely by the staff, and I thought it would be good if a few members of council got a look at the agenda and had an opportunity to comment and weigh in on whether or not the mix of things that's included here, the time that's being devoted to them. Now, you should have received this morning, or you should have, does everybody have this thing? So I think it might be helpful if we just kind of go through this agenda, and I'm interested to hear any comments you may have about what in detail we should be doing during these designated periods. I think the framework itself works well, so appreciate that. And the only thing that might be left for us to do is look into it and see if we can kind of develop in any more detail what would occur during certain periods here. And I would point out in particular that there are 3 sessions starting with the Goals for 2020 and Beyond, which is a 2-hour segment on the first morning. That's pretty broad-based. So maybe, Mr. Manager, if you can tell us what you gleaned from the survey that was conducted of council members, what kind of things, how you think that's going to work. Was the intention that the facilitator will report on what came back from us, or what's the structure of that conversation?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. So that's what will occur. What I'd like to do is, and I should have started off with this, add to it that because public safety came up so prevalently in the surveys, we are dedicating Monday's strategy session to public safety. Even when I go back and think about the swearing-in ceremony, public safety as a public health crisis, as well as public safety being more than just, let's say, police officers or firefighters, we acknowledge that. So we want to make sure that even before going into the retreat, that there is significant time set aside this Monday to discuss that. But to your point, Mr. Chair, the facilitator will take much of what was gleaned from your surveys and try to find some level of connectivity between them. And how much would you like to discuss some of these items at the retreat? How much would you like to discuss them at a later date, whether it's a strategy session, whether it's referred to committee, or whether or not it is something that you just need more information on? In the pre-reads, we will also, to the extent possible, answer as many of the questions that came out of that survey too.
So I think the goal of this session and the other longer discussion sessions is for us as council members to communicate as clearly and succinctly as possible what we want to do this year, what our priorities are, where we want the emphasis to be, and also, since we are a budget committee as well, how we want to prioritize and commit our resources. That's the idea. The comment you just made about public safety came about partly because if you look at this retreat agenda, it doesn't appear as a topic. And we really don't want the community to get the impression that we are not very concerned about this and paying a lot of attention to it. So the answer was that we would, before we even go into this retreat, we would kind of make public the fact that we intend to meet on Monday and devote quite a lot of time to this question. On that one, by the way, personally, I have a question about, it has been described as a public health crisis, and that's a very evocative description. I know that some people I've talked to are not sure what it means, because they're used to thinking of the CDC and the National Institutes for Health and so on. So it's a sort of social health crisis, but how does that inform the options that we're thinking about as a way of addressing it?
Sure. So thank you, Mr. Chair. Many times we think about public safety in terms of police officers. But what we are learning, and Dr. Harris, Gibby Harris from the county, has done some significant work, and recently an analysis that she provided to the County Board of Commissioners or subcommittee back in September to start to think more of the root causes. So, for instance, we know that based on a child's third grade reading level, we can start building prison cells. So it's more of a community-wide effort. What are the things, what are the investments that we're making that could help deal with some of these root causes that lead to the violence that we see?
And I also want to make a comment about that, because that phrase has been coming up even though we have been using it for a while. And when I say we, that's the discussions that are taking place between the city, the county, the public health department, the schools. It does also involve the partnerships in intervention, not just the investment, but the partnerships in intervention. That's a critical part of it as well. And I say that because it's very frustrating to me that the media is just getting on this now, as if we haven't been talking about it, when it actually been talking about it for years and years. Just calling it something different now doesn't change the fact that this is an approach that we have tried before. We're not doing it effectively because it's so siloed between different bodies of government, quite frankly. But
Well,
it's a social health crisis, a public health crisis. It's, you know.
And the thing is, we did the things we did in the past, and this past year, the number was way up. So it looks like we're missing the mark, or maybe that the causes of this are actually beyond the scope of our control. I mean, when we had the Keith Lamont Scott aftermath, we thought about a community action plan. And that was, at that time, we were looking at what was within the scope of the city to do that might address these issues. We came up with housing, policing, job creation, and so on. And clearly, that has not had the effect of improving the underlying issue. I mean, of course, there's a distinction between just the murder rate and police shootings. But it's all kind of related. And so I think what we're saying is, and I'm interested in the views of the committee, that we will not talk about this at the retreat, but that we will simply make public that we intend to spend quite a lot of time talking about it at our first strategy session the Monday after.
So Mr. Chair, I'm not suggesting that this would not be discussed at the retreat.
But it's not on the agenda. It's not identified.
Right, but under your goals for 2020 and beyond, those first 2 hours, many of the,
okay.
you can do anything. Yes.
Right,
Yeah.
all right, yeah, but I just, okay, point taken. But the idea is that we fully recognize the issue and we plan to work on it on Monday. Well,
Just to point out again, we is the operative word here. We is not city council. We has got to be the community, and I think that ties in very much to the public health crisis. And so
Right.
we aren't going to solve it as a city council. We has got to be a broader conversation.
Well, you know, what can we do
To be a
kind
part of
to
it.
mobilize other resources in the city? Mr. Winston?
I think part of recognizing it as a public health crisis, but more so in terms of it not being on the agenda, but looking we have to look at this issue, just as many of the big issues, kind of horizontally, that this is not something that we look at just, from, as it said, from a police standpoint, how is this department going to function in this? But how are we addressing crime? How are we really addressing poverty, which is the underlying, because crime is a function of poverty most greatly, and that relates to public health and all of those other things. So I think as we are thinking about this, as we are thinking about all these big issues, I think the point is that we have to always be dealing with it in some way with whatever policy decisions, whatever decisions that we're making week to week, day to day.
Yeah, and I agree. I'm glad that we're talking about it on Monday as a separate item. I think it clearly demonstrates where the council is going right from the start of the year, and I hope that we can even drill down more at the retreat, i.e., not only do we talk about it as a public health crisis, but we also talk about where we're going forward with emergency management, which is the broader issue, i.e., we got hypothetically 2021, 17 more public events that's going to have over 30,000 more folks there, plus the 5 concerts. So, I mean, the terrorist gets to be right once. We got to be right every time we have a big public event. So I would hope that we would talk about specifically on Monday the issue of what are we going to do collectively as a council and then abroad across governmental lines, which is where a lot of the things that we have to do, I believe, is under the domain of the county. And how do we begin to work together to accomplish solving this public health crisis? And I called it at the swearing in, that's what it is. But more importantly, at the retreat, how do we begin to really think about emergency management, where we're not only talking about police, but we're talking about fire, we're talking about emergency preparation for these large-scale events that we'll be doing a lot more frequently come 2021. I mean, is that involved in the negotiations? Who's going to play for the extra police officers for 17 more soccer matches, hypothetically, or 5, 7 more big concerts with 70,000 votes there. Golf Brooks, how's that going to be absorbed? So hopefully there'll be a bigger picture, and that we drill down to the various issues like the murder rate in Charlotte. That's how hopefully we can kind of begin talking about it.
So, Mr. Chair, Councilmember Graham, I totally agree with you. So on Monday, one of the things that we'd like to discuss to begin with, and I don't think we've really had this discussion, is these evidence-based programs. So we have a lot of programs, and it's not just around public safety. As we start to go back the last couple of decades, if there's a initiative out there, throw a program at it, and we're not sure how successful those programs have been. So when we start to discuss this in terms of not just the city, but the county, the schools, our partners, as well as what has been proven to work, it really changes the focus. So that's part of Monday. And then as we go into the retreat, absolutely, what's the impact of more events, the impact of what we're seeing on our resources will be a part of it.
The actual retreat should produce kind of deliverables, should produce tangible goals. So what can happen, and what has in my experience happened, is you do get a lot of presentations, people go away, and if you ask yourself afterwards, okay, what's our plan, or what are we going to do that's different? So I'm hoping that we will be very tangible and action-oriented with a lot of what we talk about. And again, I'm looking at the 3 segments, the goal for 2020 and beyond, the planning for the year ahead, and the building a livable city. And I'm trying to imagine how that time breaks up into these particular topics. And the topics in broad terms are the same: jobs and opportunity, transportation, housing, public safety. So really this is, our working plan for this year. So do we have specific initiatives associated with budget outlays that we intend to implement this year? And are we going to schedule meetings with the funders of the courts and the district attorney in order to try to get their resources increased, because we are legitimate stakeholders in all of that. Things like that. So I just want to make sure that we don't, all kind of express opinions and then walk away and do not have like events and dates in mind for when we're going to do things.
Yeah, so thank you, Mr. Chair. So I started off with talking about the 2018 retreat because I think in terms of tangible outcomes, it's the best that we have right now. Because we did think about, we had a topic. You had many topics, but you locked in on affordable housing. Last year, you locked in on jobs, the economy, and upward mobility. This year, for the last, I would say, 5-6 months, we've been talking about mobility, accessibility, and connectivity, transportation, transit. And that is what we've always perceived as being the big takeaway from this retreat. It doesn't mean that it dominates everything. And I believe that day 2 of the retreat is the main focus of that. You will have not only the guy to my left talk about Ryan Bergman, he does have a name, I'm sorry, talk about our capital improvement plan, which, if you will recall, we're on the last cycle of the 4 bond cycles, right? So 2018, 16, and 14. So back in 13, more or less the city locked in to 4 bond cycles. So a bit we will introduce not just the 2020 bond cycle that's already been pre-populated, but also begin to talk about the bond cycles that have nothing associated with them, 22, 24, 26, 28. But I would like for everybody to understand that starting off, we do have an affordability opportunity in each one of those cycles. $223 million is what we have set aside for each one of those bond cycles. I'm not going to make eye contact with Kelly Flannery, who's in the corner right now, our CFO, because those numbers will change. Hopefully they only get better. But we have a great opportunity when we discuss mobility, accessibility, and connectivity. How are we going to go about populating those bond cycles in the future? And it's perfect alignment in terms of the 2040 plan and everything that we're doing, because the bulk of what's in those bond cycles outside of our COPS, which is the correct term for that, not the acronym, certificates of
What did they change it to?
Participation.
Yeah, I just don't want to talk in acronyms. Certificates of participation, which the
Not CMPD.
You're right, which the voters do not vote on. But outside of that, for the most part, the bonds have been around affordable housing, or housing, neighborhoods, and transportation. So again, it's just a great alignment. As Councilmember Winston said earlier, if we look at this horizontally, it's an opportunity to address so many things, because since I've been here for the first time, there's a clean slate in terms of the future bonds.
I'd like to encourage committee members to kind of bring up things that they think we should talk about, and I can imagine there are a couple on your mind. Yes, Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, in terms of the debt capacity, and I think I was going to bring up that topic. Also, if we can have a capital projects overview. So I know there will be 4 bond cycle, but what has not been used, and what if there is anything we should be looking at in terms of cost surplus, maybe, or maybe not surplus. So if we can look at the capital projects and figure out if there are any opportunities that we could use in future, and just the entire schedule of all the capital projects, and see where we are with it. Are we meeting the targets? And also having some sort of metrics. I agree with what Mr. Drake said about having specific deliverables, but also metrics and performance. I mean, how do we know we met X, Y, and Z. So having some sort of goals around mobility would be important because it's such a, it's a very general topic. But how do we measure that we have done what we could do in a year to tackle upward mobility? Right? It could be measured from transportation perspective in building equity, or it could be creating more jobs, or it could be really addressing some of our homicides. But that's, again, I think to what Mayor Pro Tem had said, that is more of a community-wide issue. But I think having some sort of metrics would help us track our progress on all of these issues.
Mayor Pro Tem, I know you had issues about bus transportation and also in the context, I think, of a lot of the social issues we're trying to address.
Yeah, I think, the manager pointed out that the discussion really this next year, the high-level theme is going to be about transportation, mobility, connectivity, and we've all been talking about the bus system and the need to make our bus system more efficient. And we know what the number is, more or less, from John Lewis. So if we really are saying that that's a value that we have, that we all want to carry out, we need to be able to have the discussion in the retreat about the budget itself and what those numbers mean. Because if it's going to cost to get down to the sort of best practice of 30 minutes, and I don't know how long that would take us, how long we want it to take us, but if that's $35 million in operating costs and $100 million in capital, then we really have to have that conversation at the retreat. Or what are the trade-offs? How are we going to achieve that? Some cities have said, once that number gets put out there, cities like Seattle said, you need to move that up because we want that now. And so they had to really look at their bond referendums and their bond structure. What does it mean to move it up? What does that mean from an accessibility standpoint vis-a-vis building more housing, right? Because if you're talking about our bus system, if we could make it more efficient, that also, to the point of being more horizontal, that plays into what we consider to be affordable living. So these have some big price tags attached to them, and I think we've got to have these conversations at the retreat because there will have to be choices made.
I'm just going to comment on that, Mr. Whitson. The CATS right now is funded by a half-cent sales tax, by a maintenance of effort payment from the city, and by fare box collections, basically, right? So what that could imply is that we need to take a fundamental look at the resources that are available, because operating within those constraints, they've already told us this is kind of what we can do, and this is what we have the capacity for. It looks like what our aspiration is to have more bus service than can be funded from those sources. So maybe the question is, do we take a basic look at whether we step outside? And if so, what does that look like? I mean, the sales tax thing, the dedicated half-cent sales tax, we have technically a quarter-cent capacity on sales tax generally that was not taken up in this recent referendum. Anyway, I just put that out there. I think our conversations about the buses so far have reached a certain point and then just trailed off. And it looks to me like there's a recognition of a need and no kind of solution. Mr. Winston.
So one of my suggestions would be, I have three things I want to say. The manager keeps referring to 2018 retreat, and I think there are two things that we did there that made that very successful, and I would suggest we try to implement that, not just at that meeting, but as you said, Mr. Driggs, throughout the year, because we're going to lay out our year. The mayor introduced the matrix of high cost, high return, low cost, high return, low cost, those four things, and we operated from that, and staff operated from that, and we were able to see those things tangibly, and we were able to make decisions on what we do then. Then we had the 30, 60, 90-day approach. So we came out of there with a very We use that maybe through the budget process during 2018, but we highly abandoned that as an entire council, as an entire organization. I think if we come out of there with that matrix, with that 30, 60, 90-day approach, and then have a plan to revisit that in the 30, 60, 90 days, to continue to look at where we are on our matrix and to kind of retouch, and that would be really valuable. And hopefully we can implement that throughout the time so that we can do those things like those buses. We can say, okay, this makes sense, but that might make a little more sense. Let's go and tell staff to go and do that. That would be my suggestion. Number two, looking over at the agenda, something that I thought was very helpful last year and just helpful in general is something physical, where we are working as a team, as we are being physically. We did the improv thing last time, but something that kind of makes us think a little differently, critically, and as a team, figuring out how to team build. I've always found that experience works very well, and it's worthwhile. It's worth an hour or two when you're in the same room with the same group of people that you're supposed to be working with. That goes a long way. Last thing I have to say, I think would be valuable specifically for the returning members of council. What we do in between budget cycles is really a function either of the last budget or a future budget. And between there, we ask things of staff. We ask for information that inform our priorities, inform where we want to be, where we want the process to go. I think it would be very helpful if staff kind of went back through the minutes of the meetings and was able to give individual council members questions that they asked, topics that they brought up that we might have forgotten, or specifics that might still be a priority. It would be very valuable to at least be able to reference those things so that we can talk from a body of work amongst each other, and not just whatever idea that we can recall at that moment in time.
Mr. Chair, to respond to that, so thank you, Mr. Winston. Now, I may have to abandon not giving you 6 inches of paper, but no, I totally agree with you, and we'll add to that the response. So sometimes what I hear is that we have not responded to council, but then we go back and we realize that we did, but if we did and you didn't get it, that means that we're not responding. So we need to find better ways to communicate with council so that some questions that come up don't continuously come up. We need to do a better job of answering those. So we'll add to your request of going through the minutes, but also try to find as many responses that address them. Sir.
Just an observation as I kind of went through the agenda. One, I agree with Braxton that when we have a conversation about crime, that we just don't skip over the issue of poverty, that we kind of really kind of talk about that in a cohesive type of way. I don't know whether it's a speaker that comes up and kind of give us a high-level overview, or someone that's actually working in the trenches, but I think we really need to know what's happening out there, and if there's some things that we can do, 30, 60, 90, whatever, to kind of address it. I think that's important. I think it sends the right message to the community. Secondly, also on the January 14th, which is a national holiday, I don't know why we're working that day. It's my birthday, so somebody has to patrol, but we'll talk about that. We'll talk about that later.
I think we have our idea for.
Just come to my room. We'll take care of that. But we're also talking about economic development that day, right? And we've done a great job talking about the big shiny stuff. I think it's kind of easy. It's the harder stuff that I really want to drill down on when we talk about economic development, corridors and neighborhoods and communities, and strategies to work with transforming our small business program from a procurement base to actually kind of getting people and pinning people in business along these fragile and threatened corridors. So I appreciate the conversation for economic development. I'm looking forward to it. Obviously, we need to have a conversation with the Honeywells and, all those things, soccer. But to keep my interest, I really would like to drill down and talk about what's happening on the ground. What can we do to transform Freedom and Tuckasegee and Baysford Road, and how can we incentivize a small business that may, I know a young lady that owns a restaurant on Graham Street. She wants to relocate somewhere in the city. Is there a role for the city to pay that, to relocate that business, which is a sit-down restaurant, to a quarter that doesn't have a sit-down restaurant? So it's kind of thinking out of the box, economic development-wise. Obviously, we'll do the big stuff. That's important. Those are job generators and creators. We got to do those things, but if people can't get the jobs, and if we don't do anything to empower corridors and communities where people live, and it's just another press conference for a billionaire.
So I totally agree with you, Councilmember Graham. It's I guess the first time that I saw Assistant City Manager, I'm going to talk about you a little bit, Angela Lee kind of sort of go off in a meeting.
Angela can go off?
when we didn't talk about the corridors. And so this, by design, we'll have Tracy and Todd tag teaming this so that we do the entire array, even down to the block level. So we're trying to, but this is being very helpful because we'll try to make sure we document all the programs that are out there too.
I was just wrap my mind.
Yeah.
What's in the toolbox?
Yeah.
What is in the toolbox? What is all out of date? What needs premium gas versus regular gas? What do we need to just throw away?
Yeah.
And reinvent something else.
Yeah.
I mean, so.
Okay, good.
I think part of that is we can't let our pursuit of the shiny things unintentionally and indirectly work against our social objectives. So, if you upgrade neighborhoods and they get gentrified, or you have a blue line corridor sort of situation where all the new construction is these expensive apartments, you haven't kind of advanced the priorities that we have. I would mention on the crime thing, if we had a segment where at the retreat, where you said this is the plan for Monday. Otherwise, we're going to end up having the entire conversation, Monday conversation, at the retreat.
Sure.
So I think if that is your goal, and if that's the way we want this to work, then we should kind of define what we plan to do on Monday, maybe give a preview, and not then end up in a position where Monday is redundant.
Okay.
This Monday.
The Monday
retreat
strategy
Monday.
session.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
The strategy session. Right. I wanted to bring up, I want to mention also Councilmember Mitchell in his priorities talks about CBI, and I think this relates also to the economic opportunity thing, the work we're doing to try to get businesses signed up to participate in our program and kind of expand the scope of the ways that we seek to create opportunity. So I think as we look at economic development, it needs to be clear this is not just about getting new businesses to come here with $100,000 a year jobs, but it really means development, internally as well. Anybody else? I wanted to ask about housing. We did a $50 million bond initially with the plan of going to 25 and 15 in the subsequent bond cycles. Then we did 50 in the next bond cycle. Do you intend to make a recommendation for a further 50 in the 2020 bond cycle, or what does that look like going forward?
So, Mr. Chair, you, in the FY20 budget that was approved in June, the 2020 bond did bump up from 25 million to 50 million.
Right. That's the 2020 bond. So we'll be talking about anything. We will not be talking about bonds for housing at this retreat.
You will be talking about populating the 2022 bond, the 2024 bond, the 2026, which are zeros right now.
Right.
That's a part of the discussion.
So will you have a recommendation that you intend to?
No, absolutely not.
All right. I mean, that's To me, a lot of these conversations are interesting in the context of what else you're giving up. Like, as I keep saying, we need to make these big commitments in an environment where we're not disregarding other obligations. So if we put $50 million into housing in every bond cycle, that's about almost a quarter of our capacity. And even though it's a very important priority for us, we have the blocking and tackling on the streets and things like that we need to do. And now we're talking about a $6 billion Silver Line project. So, we need to make sort of visible how we think all this is going to work.
I have another topic.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
And I haven't brought this up to you, Mr. Chair, but over the holiday, I have been giving this a lot of thought. In our budget, I think that we fund the arts to a greater degree than we even give ourselves credit for, because of our placemaking grants and some of our other grant processes that other cities consider in their arts and cultural. Other cities have their own departments, and those grants fall within those budgets. And so in light of the fact that the sales tax for the arts failed, I wonder if the city, the council would entertain the idea of us doing, working with a consultant like Boston has done it with a company called TDC, as have some of the other cities, of doing a citywide cultural planning process, a study to look at what we do as a community to support arts and culture, and capture what we as a city actually do fund and how we might do it better. So the question would be within our, and maybe that's, I don't know how much that costs, so I don't know if that's within your control anyway, or what the process would be for that. But I think that's something that I would like to have discussed at the retreat as well.
So Mayor Pro Tem, you will have that in the pre-read, because that's one of the items that came up in the questionnaire of the council members. Now, how deep it is, it wouldn't reach to where you are, but still, that would be a document that you would have at that first 2 hours of the retreat to put on the table to see what the council would like for us to do in terms of priority.
Okay, so that is in there.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
I'm in an interesting position because the mayor has a sense of humor, and after my loud opposition to the sales tax for the arts and other things, appointed me to the board of the Arts and Science Council.
Our other colleague in opposition got put on the other arts board, so
yeah, that's right.
I'm not too miffed, but
so I guess we'll get converted. Environment. Did you want to speak?
Yeah, but go ahead.
I was just going to say, we have in place a CAP. We're on a certain trajectory, I think. We've had conversations about buses and things, which pointed to constraints on the technology and on the finances, the federal government role, and those things, particularly in the context of the transportation discussion. We also need to be looking at what I guess is one of the early frontiers of our environmental efforts, which is on the buses. So is there any news, or would you come to us saying these are the things you're going to have to decide this year in relation to the implementation of CAP?
So, yes, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure if you're setting me up, but I'll take the bait, okay? So we are now, the first year of the CAP was basically planning. And I think if we go back to the report, by year 2, there would actually be dollars associated with buildings and transportation infrastructure, whether it's electric vehicles for our fleet or what we're doing as we design buildings. So while I said earlier that I would not come to you with a recommendation as related to the Housing Trust Fund bond, because that's where we're looking for guidance from you, we got guidance from this council over a year ago in terms of that plan. So yes, you will start to see that there are going to be asks as it relates to electrifying the fleet and what we do in our buildings. And as we knew from the beginning, there is some costs over and above what's a baseline when it comes to being more energy efficient with their buildings. So long-winded way, I apologize for saying yes.
So again, I'm getting back to these great blank spaces in our agenda will a facilitator actually kind of bring up these topics? Is it going to be left to us to kind of say, what about the environment? How about housing? Or
Right.
how does that work?
So, Mr. Chair, what I hope, and this is what Taiwo would say, hope is not a strategy, is that that doesn't come up, because we asked for your input on the front end, and we're trying to capture as much information as we can. Now, if all of a sudden there's something new that comes up Monday, of course it's going to be discussed, but our strong desire was that the surveys that we got from you were the things that you wanted to talk about at the retreat.
So the environmental issues were not on there?
Not as much, we were very surprised, not as much as,
I mean, I think for many of us, they're probably, not right alongside crime and transportation, but, they are a council priority.
Yes.
So I would just suggest that you be ready for questions about that.
absolutely, and again, because you already approved the plan over a year ago, we're executing the plan, so it's.
Right, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah.
We're on that track, right?
Yes,
So then the
absolutely.
question is, are there any new actions or money commitments that we have to make this year in the realization of that plan?
There will be, yes.
Yeah. Maybe I'll take this Administrator.
So, I didn't put that in the survey because I thought we already had a plan, and it's just implementation that I think the staff is already doing that.
Yes.
Though I'd like an update on circular economy, I think the plan that originally that council had approved, initial funding of $500,000, we should have seen some sort of implementation by now. So I think if we can get an update on that, I think we have put in a lot of seed investments. What's been the result?
Sure.
So I think having an update on not just CEAP, but also the circular economy and the returns on our investments and how it has helped tackle our CEAP goals.
Precisely.
I'm sorry, but with regards to going back to the buses, the environmental component of it is, do we buy electric buses? Or if we want to get down to 30-minute headways, because that's a huge budget swing if we're going to be getting there, or if our priority is to get down to those 30 minutes, or is our priority to go to electric buses? We're talking about millions of dollars in decision-making in terms of where we put our capital. So to that extent, that has to be a part of the process when we talk about buses.
And I thought I understood that there were constraints on the technology that made electric buses unsuitable in some situations, all electric, and therefore the hybrids were the kind of interim solution. But then you've got that 12-year federal funding cycle, and I'm not sure how we solve that.
New York City is
But,
going to all electric buses, so.
Right.
What's that?
New York City is going to all electric buses. So.
And even North Carolina and so many other cities have done it. And I know you talked about a pilot where we tested, because every geographical area is different. So, and I know there were several proposals by community members, including Proterra. I had a meeting with Proterra where they have several grants that are available for cities to apply for. So there is not upfront huge investment of $500,000 per bus. So I think if we can explore some of that while also addressing that efficiency that Mayor Pro Tem had addressed around around how do we make our bus routes more efficient, but at the same time addressing our 2030 goals. I think we can do both. So
we are considering a Sprinter bus, electric bus, that goes from the airport to the transit center. And what we will attempt to do is piggyback off of the infrastructure that the airport has built for their electric buses. So we'll give you a report. Each time we talk about it more, we get more information, some positive, some negative, but I'm thinking more positive than negative. So I do believe there's a chance for both. Are we going to be able to electrify the CATS buses tomorrow? No. But can we show that this can work by a Sprinter that's going back and forth from the airport to the transit center? The other thing I'd like to add is I really enjoy this dialogue that we're having, because it's something that Mr. Winston said earlier about 2018, and we're trying to structure 2020 the same way. One thing I don't want us to forget is that in 2018, you more or less gave us that direction to think boldly about the Housing Trust Fund. And prior to that, it was $15 million every other year. And you'll have 2 bond cycles that have gotten to $100 million. So I believe that as you continue to discuss these issues, whether it's the CAP or head frequencies with buses, if we get that direction, we're going to work very hard to try to get you a plan that works.
Great.
I'm going to make this comment as vice chair of Intergovernmental Relations Committee. I'm not going to speak for Ms. Bakari, but it's a conversation that we have been having specifically as it relates to as we're entering into budget season. One of the things that I've been trying to do is meet with our colleagues on different boards, County Commission, all of you individually,
School board,
and we start reaching out to school board as well, because what you said is you, Mr. Driggs and Mr. Eisel have said is very true. Depending on our priorities, those have very serious budget implications and what we can and can't do year to year. But as I'm having conversations with other people, they have similar priorities and are trying to figure out, how can they get their organizations, and sometimes there are intersections there. So I would like to, maybe if we can spend some time here, maybe it already works in goals or something like that, where we can think about, okay, how can we be more formally, I guess, interconnected with those other organizations and what they're doing. Perhaps there are things that, for instance, as around buses, I know that there are several county commissioners that have priorities around the environment and transportation in different parts of the county. So can it make sense where we focus on, for instance, I'm just throwing spaghetti on the wall. This is not where we focus on electrifying the bus fleet, and they put resources to different commute times in different parts of the county or something like that. But that's going to take, again, efforts and organization by us as a council and working with our counterparts. So I guess what it comes down to, what I'm asking, what I'm saying is there, where in this agenda can we have a discussion like that where we think about how us as council members are proactively and continuously working with other elected officials to create comprehensive policy decisions, specifically around our budget-making times.
And I think that has come up in the past, particularly as it relates to CMS. Yes.
I'm sitting here and I feel the need to say something, because I don't want to participate in the meeting, and they're like, well, she didn't say a word, right? But because I think I'm the only council person that has not attended the retreat, I don't know what the expectations are. So I just would imagine that all of our priorities and all of I saw this more as a strategic planning session and maybe a review of what the priorities are, but it's a 3 or 4 day event, right? So we as council, we still have the opportunity to implement policies outside of the meeting, obviously, right? So when you talk about intergovernmental relations, a lot of these issues, poverty, public safety, affordable and supportive housing, is a collaboration with the county and or the state. So that's just what I'm trying to understand how.
It should be.
So I'm sure, it would have, one example,
Joint retreat.
and I'm a human services professional, but one example is mental health and brain injury. We talk about, the North Carolina has an action plan that they know that there's only, I think, $37 per person for brain injury. And we know that there's a disproportionate amount in the jails, in the homeless. So there's a lot of things that we're going to do as city council and that's what I was just trying to understand, how we're in the budget meeting talking about the strategic planning session. So that's why I've been kind of quiet, but I know that we have an opportunity that we're going to be doing work outside of what's in the strategic planning
Can I respond?
session,
We can-
right?
we can
Right now, it's not
consolidate.
budget meeting. Just to be clear, that was what I was trying to explain. But this at the moment is more of a
It's on
council
record.
retreat committee meeting or a governance meeting. So that's why, we're addressing all these issues. It's about the retreat. You'll know the budget meeting when you see it.
Can I respond to that, Mr. Drew?
Yes, go ahead.
Ms. Johnson, since I probably am the closest to you in terms of, 2 years ago, I was going through my first retreat as well, and you're going to get a lot of information. You're right, there's time and opportunity, plenty of time and opportunity to have all the other discussions. This is really the unique opportunity for us as council and with our senior staff to get our ship right. And to really, as Mr. Drake said, this is really going to inform our ship.
Either was he said that, I heard it.
Our ship in order. But so this is, if we're successful coming out, if we're able to put, honestly, everything on the table and then literally get it in order, and we have a framework for us to operate under, we are clear with each other, our staff is getting clear guidance, and that informs all the other work that we do week to week, month to month, to do all of those other things. But outside of this, there's not going to be a lot of opportunity for us to have kind of critical and meandering kind of conversations. And while it is always based in policy, we won't be making any policy decisions there. We'll be throwing out ideas and figuring out how to get meat on those bones. So that's what I think I look forward to in those 3 or 4 days that we just won't get another opportunity to do until next January.
I just wanted to follow up on that. Also, there would be times where issues might come up that are not addressed or were not part of our overall retreat, and I think that we will still have that opportunity to discuss that at a later time. So I know in 2018 when we had a retreat, or 2019. There were several items that I think we didn't discuss as a council, but then when the issues came up, we were able to address them through policy or through strategic sessions. So there is still strategic sessions that's going to continue every first Monday of the month for anything that comes up. Right. So if you can't think of something right now, I'm sure there will be another opportunity. This is an important session where we have a lot to talk about, but I'm sure there would be a few things that will come up from now to, I guess, after the retreat, or something from now to even June or July. So.
Okay, so about time to wrap up. Clearly, we're going to have to talk about the 2040 plan, right? And there's a lot that goes with that. I agree with the point about intergovernmental. In particular, our housing policies and zoning decisions have a profound effect on the school system. And I'm not sure that we have fully addressed that dynamic. So that's something that will probably come up. But I hope you have taken away from this a sense of our desire to just chart a course and come away with a reasonably clear understanding of what sort of things we want to work on during the year.
It's been very helpful, yes.
Any other comments? Okay, do I have a motion to adjourn?
party.
All in favor, stand up.